tape number 1. Mr. Gaskill, I'd like to start out by asking when you were born, please.
September 30th, 1902.
And where were you born, sir?
At Ocracoke.
Were you born right here?
Right here in local, not in this particular house, but my old home was up near, right near the Ocracoke lighthouse, where Clinton Gaskill now lives. That was my old homestead.
Was that a home that your father built? The house where you were born?
As I remember, yes, that was built by local carpenters on the island. That's a small four-room house. Speaking of being hot, that was doubly hot.
How come?
Well, in them days you had no electricity, no fans, no air conditioning, of course. And you just opened the windows and hope that it would be breeze enough to keep you cool. And I even remember when I was real small, sleeping into the window with my feet to try to keep cool.
I bet it can get right warm here. Do you remember your grandparents?
Very little about my grandparents. My grandmother I remember well about, and that's about the length of it. I can go back and of my grandparents.
What was her name?
Sarah Gaskill.
And what do you remember about her?
She was just a very lovely, sweet person, and acted like she thought the world had we children, and we dearly loved her.
Did she live with you?
No, she lived over next door with my uncle Ben Gaskill, which lived right close to us.
That would have been her son?
Yes, that would have been her. Help me.
Her son? Ben Gaskill?
Ben Gaskill was my father. My father.
Cut that off just a minute. His grandmother was also a teacher, a school teacher, and taught music too.
Oh, she was?
Yes.
Do you remember her playing music?
No, I do not. She died when I was very young.
Okay. Can you tell me who were your parents' names and tell me a little bit about them?
My mother's name was Annie Gaskill. My father's name was Bill Gaskill.
Do you know how they met?
I'm afraid if you don't stop that, you'll have to have that tape where you can just almost stop it instantly.
That's
And
okay.
then don't the tape run up before we get anywhere.
That's all right. We can just...
No, I don't really know how they met other than like boys and girls meet.
Uh-huh.
And when they were first married, they went on this boat that was anchored out at the Swash and was caught in a storm and carried down on the layboat shoal and was almost lost during the old August storm. I believe that was in 1899. And then later moved to this home I'm talking about at the near the lighthouse, and raised the family up from there until I was about 13 years old. And then he bought a inn, so-called inn, called Pamlico Inn, down on the Sound shore of Pamlico Sound. And he ran that as an inn for a number of years. And that's where most of the children grew up.
Right there
At the Pamlico Inn. And that was a summer, so-called summer tourist inn. You could get 3 meals a day and lodging for $17.50 a week. I wish I could.
Did your mother help run the inn?
Very much, very much. She would she and my daddy worked together very close, and she was an excellent cook, and supervised the kitchen and dining room, and in fact the whole inn.
How big was the inn, approximately? How many?
About 20 room, take care of about 50 guests.
And where did the guests come from usually?
Mostly eastern North Carolina, towns in eastern North Carolina. Later on, they spread out more from South Carolina to Virginia, and then later on spread out more from Florida to New York as the years went on. And my father also had a hunting club on Beacon Island, which he would operate in the winter season during the duck and goose hunting season. And in the fall, about September, we would start moving into this, out of the Pamlico Inn into this hunting lodge, which I said was over at Beacon Island. And we always had a lot of preparation to do to get all of the furniture moved into the clubhouse, get it stored up with food, getting all of the decoys ready for the opening of the season, duck hunting season, which was about the 1st of November during that period of time, back in the 1915, 1920 through the 30s and 40s. And it was almost a great, some of my happiest boyhood memories were spent on that island in preparation for that duck and goose hunting season. And I remember one time during a Christmas holiday, we went over there, my father and the cook, who was named Bill Ellis Williams, and myself as a boy, and we were expecting hunters to come in on the mail boat, which then ran from Morehead City to Ocracoke, and Ocracoke back to Morehead City. We were expecting hunters on that Saturday afternoon, but the weather turned real cold and started, it was the beginning of what we term as the big freeze of 1916, 17 and 18, and the mailboat never did left Moyd City headed to Ocracoke, but had to return due to ice coming so cold, and so the mailboat never did get back to Ocracoke that day. And we were marooned on Beacon Island, froze in, so to speak, with our Pamlico Sound froze over for 21 days. We were not in need of anything. We had enough fuel, wood, mostly the kerosene, plenty of food. That it wasn't really a hardship, but I thought a very nice hunting trip. We killed 300 and some number of ducks, geese, and brant. And as I remember, when the freeze finally broke and we got back to Ocracoke, my father sold the entire bunch of game to the mailboat captain, who was Captain Will Willis at the time. And he, of course, carried them back to Moyd City.
Do you know how much you got for them?
Well, back in that day, the price of game was very cheap. A goose would sell for 75 cents. A pair of redheads would be something like $1.50 to $2. The bird we called the brant would be about 75 cents a piece. The duck called the scaup would bring maybe 50 cents a pair. They were classed as little less desirable as food. But it was a very enjoyable trip, and I now get a lot of pleasure out of thinking back in them days of when I grew up on the island and over going back and forth to Beacon Island, and they were just great days.
I want to ask you a couple things. First of all, I just want to get this straight. It was just you and the cook and your father who were on that island for 21 days?
Yes.
Was there any way of communicating
No way,
with your mother?
no way at all.
So,
That was before the day of the radio, but before the day of no communication whatever between us and the island, which was still only 3 miles away.
that was my other question, is where is Beacon Island in relation?
3 miles west of Ocracoke. 3 miles out in Pamlico Sound, 3 miles west of Ocracoke.
Mm-hmm. Was your mother worried about you?
Naturally, but I think back in the days way of thinking, they would be very worried. But I don't think they were really naturally concerned, but I don't think they were worried about it.
What did that Beacon Island look like back there?
It was just a marsh, consisted of marsh road grass. It was about 17 acres in size. And on the south end where the house was built, which was built, I believe, in 1915, and it was one of these portable houses put sectional houses, I guess, that my father had got some hunters to get for him up in the North Country. And that sat up on a hill which actually used to be a fort. It was known as Fort Beacon Island. There was a fort there during the Civil War.
So your father actually brought the building materials over there with some of his hunting friends, and that's how they put the house together there on the island?
It was in sections, like a portable house.
Was there anything else on the island at that
No,
time?
no, just that clothes.
Do you remember any of the men who would come down and hunt with the hunting club? Do you remember any of them by name?
Right offhand, I can't remember them, so I'd have to.
Were they like the tourists who came to the Pamlico Inn? Were they also from eastern North Carolina?
No, most of the hunters came from the north, New York, Connecticut, up in the northeast section of it. We had a number of people come from North Carolina, back as far as Durham, Charlotte, Raleigh, and all of the places in the
How did your father put word out of the hunting club? Did he advertise?
only by word of mouth, as people would come and have a good hunt, go back and tell their friends. He spent very little money advertising in papers or magazines, only by word of mouth, as I said.
And did he ever sell the game, or was he just...
Well, he came up in his earlier days as a so-called market hunter and shot game to help make a living. Prior to his younger days, prior to putting this club up, and prior to buying Pamlico Inn, which he ran in the summertime, and the goose hunting club in the wintertime.
Sounds like an industrious person.
But in days there was just seemingly no money. What we thought was a lot of money was now just small change.
I want to go backtrack a little bit to your early years in when you lived near the lighthouse up till when you were about age 13, I think you said. Do you remember what kinds of things you would do, say, during a typical day in the winter time, let's say?
Well, of course, you were going to school, and after school, boys would go home and build bird traps. Now, bird traps were just built out of shingles that you would strip up and start putting like this, and then you would cut a bow out of a yopon tree to put over the top of it, bend it down the sidewalk to hold that trap together. So you would set your traps that afternoon to catch birds, not to eat, but just the novel of catching them, and of course later release them. We wouldn't pin them up or wouldn't sell them or wouldn't do any harm to them in no way. They're just a boy pastime that we like very much.
What kind of birds?
I remember mockingbirds, catbirds, wrens, yellowbirds, blue jays. We had to have a wide variety of birds here on the Outer Banks.
And then you would do your studies at night, probably.
Oh yes, you always carried your book satchel, maybe homemade out of cloth or canvas, and I'm not sure what kind of grades we got during that. Yeah, during that period, Ocracoke School only consisted of 1 through 7 grades. So we considered if we got through that, we were doing pretty good. Later on, boys and girls of the island would go to places like Washington, North Carolina, through high school courses and various other towns in eastern North Carolina.
Was your school up there in the area where the lighthouse was?
No, the school at that time was right where this hotel is now, the Island Inn. In fact, that part of that building was one of the schoolhouses at that day that I went to school in. I was back in the 1915.
Do you remember much about school? What you learned?
Well, they were strictly, mostly 1 and 2 room school houses, so to speak. 2 teachers. Most of the time, the lower grades might be taught in a separate room, maybe then the grades 5, 6, and 7 would be out in another bigger room. And back in them days, my wife might tell you an interesting story that she had as a girl being raised up and going to school.
Okay, so I'll ask about that later. What about food in the winter time? What might be a typical, you say you got up in the morning. Before you went to school, what did you have to eat for breakfast?
Oatmeal was a very popular breakfast food. Oatmeal, grits, hot cakes, eggs, of course. We lived very, very good compared with a lot of people in that day I call it. My father and mother were very good providers and took real special care of we children, and as I say, we've had wonderful.
Where would you get the eggs? Where would you get the eggs?
Well, back in that day, every family had a few chickens, and you'd have your get your egg supply from that, and chickens to eat, raise them right on the yard. A lot of times each for meat, all along the Outer Banks, there was a lot of wild sheep, goats, hogs, cattle, and a lot of our meat supply was local, killed meat. No supermarkets, of course.
Do you remember any of the time when there would be a slaughter?
Well, that was generally in the fall, and a lot of families would buy pigs, very small pigs from the mainland, and pin them up and raise them to get up to 200, 300, and 400 pounds to be killed in the beginning of cold weather, usually November and December. And that was always a very joyous time and good food, hard-killing time. I'm still very fond of what's known as chitterlings.
Oh, yeah?
Did you ever hear of chitterlings? I know you've heard of them, but you probably never tried to eat them.
Never. Do you remember any? You said your mother was a good cook,
She was a very good cook.
and I wonder if you could tell me any of her special dishes or recipes that you were very fond of.
Cornbread consisted of cornmeal, a little bit of flour, maybe an egg, stir it up and set it for several hours, and then bake it, and we called it pone bread. And it was some kind of good with baked beans. I remember every Saturday, it was a ritual in our family to bake. My mother had a stone crock or a stone jar that snuff used to come in. And as the storekeepers would empty the jars, they would turn them over to families to use them for baking beans. And you would take the navy bean and usually take about 3 pints to fill a jar, and you put a little bit of molasses and sugar and bake them beans in a wood stove all day, and that was part of your weekend food supply. Baked beans and pone bread with maybe stewed chicken and cabbage or collards or whatever. Let's take a break. Joanne was noted for its fine food. Not only seafood, but some of the finest beef my father could find in the markets of Washington and Lloyd City. In addition to all kinds of seafood, I remember particularly the fine clam chowder that we could make at the old Pamlico Inn. And this colored man that we had working there would go out early in the morning and take the clams up off of the clam bed that had been planted several weeks or months prior to the summer season starting, and he would go out there and get anywhere from a half a bushel to 2 bushels of clams, depending on the number of people we had to feed during that day, and get them open fresh that morning. And then to make this clam chowder, you would run the clams through a food chopper, and also the Irish potatoes, onions, and then you would cut up pork, salt pork, and fry it out and put it in this clam chowder and cook it 3 to 5 hours to serve that night for dinner. And that was one dish I remember is going over very, very big. And of course, back in that day, they served 3 meals, breakfast, not exactly a lunch, but a big dinner, and then also a big evening meal. So we really had some very fine food.
Your mother was the supervisor in the kitchen?
She was the supervisor for the whole kitchen and dining room.
And then she would have cooks?
Oh yeah, naturally you had cooks and people to help in the dining room, and waitresses. And one thing stands out in my mind is what good chocolate pies she could make during the season. I was particularly fond of them. And homemade light rolls. Back in that day, there was no bakers, so you depended on your cooks to turn out various pastries and pies and what have you, along with the fine food.
Do you remember having to cook for that many people? Did they have any special facilities in the kitchen there at the end? Or did they just use the wood cook stove, the same as you did at home?
I remember we had a big shipmate range that you could cook for 50 people without any trouble on not one person, but maybe 2 cooks. So we had a very, very special way of cooking in that day to turn out some very
This
fine.
was wood, didn't it?
Yeah, wood.
That was wood.
They were wood, sometimes coal,
Uh-huh.
but mainly wood back in that day.
Mhm.
Another thing I remember is we called an egg custard, which consisted of eggs, sugar, butter, vanilla flavoring. Put it in a pan and bake it, and that was some kind of good eating as a dessert. And of course, back in them days, we made a number of so-called layer cakes, 3, 4, 5 layer cakes, both all flavors, chocolate, just numerous flavors.
Mhm.
And
Did your mother use recipes?
yes, there were still recipes back in that day, but you used your own imagination and what you thought. As I've always said, if you take 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 good things and mix them together, you can't come out with something better.
I asked you while we were off the tape, but I wonder if you could tell us here about storing a great amount of food there at the inn. How would you keep it preserved?
We had enormous ice boxes, just ice cool boxes. And of course you got your meats. Back in that day there was freight boats ran from Washington, Ocracoke to Washington, back to Ocracoke, that brought in all kinds of supplies 3 times a week. Also the mail boat that ran from Lloyd City to Ocracoke brought in supplies, and the same boats carried out fish back to the markets that they had brought and accumulated during the week. The fish buyers in Washington, for instance, in Washington, North Carolina, had so-called sub-buyers along the Outer Bank villages who bought fish for them and iced them down to go back on these boats as they were making their trips to Washington to bring in supplies in return, such as food, all kinds of building material. That was back in the days of the Model T Ford, and I can well remember seeing Ford cars up on the decks of these freight boats. First cars ever come to the Outer Banks, probably back in the 15, 16 to 20s lying there.
What did the freight boat, can you describe the freight boat to me? What sort of
The
boat?
freight boats of that day were boats in the 60 to 70 feet long range with gasoline, kerosene, fuel oil engines operated. And in the earlier days, they depended a lot on sail in addition to motors. They'd use the motors on calm days, but they would take advantage of the wind whenever the wind was fair to make the trip without using any fuel at all. Some of these boats were built local, some of them were built in North Carolina, some of them were built up in the Chesapeake Bay area. The boats that ran from Morehead City to Ocracoke were generally built in the Atlantic, North Carolina area. They built a very fine quality boat back in that day.
What sort of boat was the mail boat? The one that ran from Morehead to Ocracoke?
They were mostly powered with three-cylinder, 2 and 3-cylinder Lathrop engines. Very slow speed engines, but very dependable. And they would just run on for years and years and years.
Did you know the men who operated the freight boat and the mail boat, were they local people?
All of them were local people. All way back my earliest days, local people ran the freight boats, and the mail boat people were from Morehead City, Atlantic, through the different villages between here and Morehead City.
I wanted to ask about travel. We've been talking about travel back and forth from the mainland, but what about travel on the island here? How would you get from place to place? What sort of...
Well, these same boats, the mail boat and freight boat to Washington, carried passengers back and forth. In the summertime, brought tourists back to the island. So that was the mode of travel during that day in the 1800 to the 1900 up to this time. Of course, today with the modern automobile and good roads and modern ferries, it's for instance, if you wanted to go from Ocracoke to Norfolk back in the early 20s, you would get on the mail boat, leaving Ocracoke 6 o'clock in the morning, spend all that day going to Morehead City, get on a train that evening 4 o'clock, get into Norfolk the next morning 10 o'clock. Now, you can get in your car and within 5 hours, you're from Ocracoke to Norfolk by good roads and automobiles.
Can you, what was your first trip off the island? I mean, besides, I know you went to Beacon Island, but,
I used to get my father during the summertime, prior to buying and operating the Pamlico Inn. I used to buy salt mullet from the local fishermen and take them on his boat and carry them to places like Belhaven, Washington, Greenville, and put them on the market, and it was a very popular sale for that fish back in that early day, known as Ocracoke salt mullet.
Did he fish for those?
No, he bought those. He bought those from the local fishermen who would catch them and salt them, and then he would transfer them on this boat.
So you.
And my very first early recollection of early trips would be with him to Washington and Greenville. And I remember in that day I was very fond of bananas. So the first thing I remember doing when I would get in Washington is to get 10 cents, which was a lot of money during that day, and go get 3 bananas. Get 3 bananas, and boy, did I love them.
What else? Did you ever do anything there in those towns, or just kind of wait for your dad to finish his business?
Just wait around and sell your mullet, and then you, of course, return back home. A lot of times he would pick up some, buy something to sort of speculate on to bring back, like bags of potatoes, things of that sort, dry vegetables that would keep, sweet potatoes, collard greens, things that you maybe didn't have. We always had some gardens, local gardens, but didn't keep us supplied year round. So you had to import a lot of things.
So this would have been in the fall?
Yeah, in the fall of the summer, late summer and fall.
But what were those markets like in your memory in Washington and Belhaven and small stores compared with today's stores.
One thing stands out most in my mind in Washington, not telling anyone, right close where we docked, was at the foot of Market Street, and this market had just numerous kinds of meat that a market would have during that day, and I remember that very well, and the small stores and marketplaces up and down Water and Market Street.
Do you remember, did it seem like you were very, very far away from home then? Did the people seem very different to you?
Well, you didn't really get to mingle much with the people on taking them trips, other than maybe the merchants and that you were selling fish to, or farmers that you were trading. Sometimes you would trade salt fish for various produce and bring it back for resale at your home.
Let's see, wonder if you could tell me a little bit about church here in the early days, going to church.
About going to church, I remember as a boy, the church was about a mile from my home, and I always tried to practice to go to Sunday school every Sunday morning. And I remember having a Sunday school teacher one time by the name of email by Mr. Pylan, as he was known. And back in that day, money was so scarce that if you got a penny to carry to Sunday school, well, that was it.
His name was Piling?
Piland. Pylan.
Uh-huh.
He also ran a general store down on the edge of Silver Lake. He was a very friendly, likable gentleman.
Was the church, was it Methodist?
Methodist Church.
Did you,
Back in that day, there was two so-called Methodist churches, Northern and Southern Methodist. Now I'm talking about back in the 1910 to 1930. Later, those churches were consolidated and now known as the Ocracoke United Methodist Church. At present, we also have a church called the Assembly of God Church on Ocracoke, and that's the two churches that now are here.
I wonder if you could tell me about any kinds of social gatherings at that the church would sponsor.
Social gatherings were not too often, but we would have sometimes family reunions, and every family would carry a box lunch out to the church and spread it out on tables, and everybody would feast on that during as social events.
What about holiday times?
Well, we always tried to celebrate holidays, especially Christmas and Easter, 4th of July, Thanksgiving, of course. They were about four of the outstanding holidays that were special, more special than the average.
How was Christmas celebrated in your family?
Pretty much the same through my lifetime. Of course, back in that day, as I have said before, when money was so scarce, if you got just the necessities of life, such as a new pair of shoes or a new suit or something that you really needed, not just a numerous toys that children get today. But it was just a great time, and we look forward so much to Christmas. And back in that day, it seemed so long from one Christmas to another. And now that I have become 85 years old, the years only have 3 months in them. That's how time goes by.
Well, I'd like to ask you some questions about your later years and how you kind of got into what you did after you got out of school and all, how did you?
Well, when I first got out of school, I immediately acquired a small boat and went in the fishing and hunting business along with my father and family down at the Tamlico. And I've been in the fishing, so-called fishing guide, fishing and hunting guide service all my life, with the exception of the 3 years during the last World War that I was connected with the Navy, in the Naval Service, running a supply boat from Ocracoke Naval Base to Cherry Point, running food supplies and just numerous things of equipment, from depth charges to all sorts of supplies. So immediately after getting out of the service, about 3 years and 3 months, I returned back to my local job of taking people hunting and fishing, which I have enjoyed over the years so much. And I guess that's the reason I could continue that long, and because I thoroughly enjoyed it, meeting people, and with the outside world, you have some of the finest people in the world come right here in the tourist business. Hunters and fishermen and just general tourists and families, and I love them all.
Did you become friendly with the tourists over the years? Did you have special ties with certain of your visitors?
Well, not no special ties. You had to treat them all alike, the rich and the poor and the middle class. So you couldn't play any favorites. Try to catch fish for all of them, try to see that they all had a good time and enjoyed the trip.
Do you have any memorable fishing stories that you could tell me of a particularly big catch?
One of my favorite, probably, fishing trips, as I remember, back in the days before there was ever thought of putting in a limit on how many fish you can catch or what have you. I remember going down to the inlet one day with a party of 3 people, and we caught 35 channel bass weighing over 1,100 pounds. As I think back on it now, it's just not reasonable to want to catch that many fish. But back in that day, fish were seemingly more plentiful, and you didn't think of it as we do today. Today we tried to be a lot more conservative and be satisfied with smaller catches of fish and smaller amounts of game, and try to teach all the young people to go hunting and fishing as a sport, and not to see how many fish they can catch and how much game they can kill, but how much enjoyment they can have out of its catching and killing fear. And that's what we need to try to get this upcoming generation to get over, to understand that we need to conserve more.
Were you say that fish seem to be more plentiful at a certain point.
Some species of fish were more plentiful back in my boyhood days than they are today. But still, all fish go in cycles, and you have years of plenty of a certain species, and then it will come to where you'll have years of scarcity of the same species. So,
is that from overfishing?
Overfishing, different types of today's types of fishing compared with 50 years ago. We're continually trying to do something about it to preserve the fish and game, but sometimes I think we're not doing a very good job at it.
Can you tell me a little bit about some of the fishing methods that were used early on, and how they might differ from today?
Well, one of the biggest changes in the method, maybe when I was a boy compared with today, you started out with sailboats and just a hand line or reed poles, and you just went out to the shallower sloughs and channels and fished, and could always catch trout and bluefish and spot and croakers. Today's boats are much bigger, much more well equipped, modern day rods and reels and fishing gear, so there's just really no comparison with the methods of taking fish today compared with them. Of course, the commercial methods of taking fish were by nets, power nets, haul nets, where today we have bigger boats, bigger so-called trawl, use trawl nets that were seemingly destroying more fish per amount of fish that we can sell than we used to.
Why? I don't understand that. Why is that?
That's pretty hard to answer, because the method of, for instance, taking shrimp has to be with trawl nets, and in order to catch the shrimp this way, you had to destroy a lot of small fish that would one day maybe grow up to be sellable, edible food fish.
So they accidentally catch them in the shrimp net?
Yeah. That's there's never seemingly been any method to take shrimp without destroying a lot of valuable fingerling, trout, croaker, spot, various kinds of fish.
Do you remember net fishing? Was there earlier, in the earlier years, net fishing?
Yes, I've done some net fishing in my earlier days. But I just never did seem to. You could make what you would need out of this fishing business, not what you want. You could make enough to really get the necessities of life.
You showed me a picture before and said that you built one of your boats. Did you frequently build the boats that you fished in?
Not the last one I had. These boats that I built were smaller boats called skiffs. rowboats, shove boats, net boats. All of my commercial boats have been built by people down in Clear Sound through the.
How do you
Go ahead.
how do you build a boat?
Well, the last boat I built, I went over to Mateo and got the juniper lumber to build this boat out of. Carried it all the way over to a mill to have it dressed, and then had somebody, a trucker from Hatteras, to pick it up for me at the mill after it had been dressed. So when I finally got that lumber home, I put it under the house to so-called dry before I started to build the boat. And after a year of really seasoning that lumber, I started on this boat in January after getting through my hunting job for that winter, and proceeded to, during the next 3 months with the help of my boys, to build this boat. We enjoyed that very much, and it turned out to be a very, very comfortable, workable boat for my hunting job. And then after the hunting gave out, I couldn't use it anymore, so I had to sell it. I sold it up in Avon to a friend, a man who wanted it for a net boat commercial.
Did you use a design or a plan to build the boat?
Only in my own mind, and draw out your sketch of how you think it ought to be and look, and just work from day to day without actually any blueprint or.
That's amazing to me. I don't know anything about it, so I'm interested.
Well, some of the best workers have been creative persons that have ideas how they want to do something, and just go ahead and do it from there.
This is tape 3. Mr. Gaskill, I wanted to ask you some questions about your work as a hunting guide. You had talked earlier about your father and the hunting club out on Beacon Island, but I guess later you worked as a hunting guide, and I wanted to ask what were the differences between the time when you were working as a hunting guide and when your father had his business as a hunting guide?
Well, this, about hunting, back in the days when I'm talking about my father having a club on Beacon Island, that lasted up to about 1940. Then began with the disappearance of the natural eelgrass, which was the natural food for the duck and goose. And when that disappeared, the game practically disappeared with it. Then again, after the last World War, the game began to come back some, and I picked up the hunting part of the game again. And then I put my hunting blinds down in the area known as Quack Hammock on Ocracoke Island, on the north end of Ocracoke Island. And I had blinds known as curtain blinds out on Jess's Reef and Legged Lump. That's big sandbars out in the Pamlico Sound. And these curtain blinds were very much like the old battery, only they were stationary instead of movable like the early batteries of the earlier hunting days. And that got to be a pretty profitable business for, I guess, 10 or 15 years. And quite successful in that until the game again began to disappear. So I decided it was time to get out of that business.
Did you use the live decoys at that time?
No, the live decoys were used way back in the earlier days of my hunting, but after about 1930, live decoys were outlawed, so we didn't, of course, use them anymore.
Did you ever do any carving? Did you carve decoys?
No, I made a number of decoys, but they were the canvas type. It was a skeleton type made of wire and formed the bodies and then covered with canvas. And of course the heads were carved out of juniper, and I made a lot of them for my own use.
Were those canvas decoys then painted?
Oh yeah, they were painted after you put the canvas on.
Okay, and I also want to ask you some questions about the war, and I'd just like to start out by asking you if you can tell me how you felt and what you remember about what you were doing when you heard about Pearl Harbor.
I was, of course, living here in Ocracoke at the time, and when Ocracoke Naval Base was established, I happened to be on the boat that was running the material in here to build the Ocracoke base. And at the conclusion of the finishing of that base, the commander in charge at the naval base asked me if I would take this boat over running supplies. I immediately said yes, because then days jobs were hard to come by. So I was sent on to Norfolk, Virginia to enlist, had to enlist in the Navy, and immediately was sent back on this boat, which was taken over by the Navy to make a food supply boat out of, to run from Ocracoke to Cherry Point Air Base. That's where we got all our food supplies, as well as the material for building this base. And this base at the time had about 500 or 600 men stationed here, and just numerous patrol boats, submarine chasers, and that's where the all of the depth charges that were brought over here were brought on this supply boat. We were probably the most submarine activity along the Atlantic coast was right off Ocracoke, between Ocracoke and Cape Hatteras, right off that shore. Well, I'd say the east coast from Norfolk to Charleston was the center of the submarine activity during the World War, Last World War. In fact, my youngest brother was on a ship that was sunk by a German submarine right off the North Carolina coast, in fact, right off Davis Shore, which is just north of Cape Lookout. And the ship was sunk, and only, I think, 5 or 6 survivors out of the whole crew that were saved. And my youngest brother was the third mate on that ship. The ship's name was the Carib Sea. It was out at the church here at Ocracoke. There's a cross up on the altar that was made by a member of that church, Homer Howard, in memory of this cross was made from the material that was a piece of the cabin of that ship, was found on the ocean side of Ocracoke by Chris Gaskill. And this cross stands as in memory of my brother, Jim Bond Gaskill.
That's very touching. Really. When you ran the supply boat, did you feel like there was any danger involved? Were you ever?
No.
Did you ever?
No, this was strictly supply line job. The only thing you had to combat was weather. Not like you had to be very careful about not overloading your boat and knowing when to go and when to not go.
How often did you make that trip?
Usually once a week, sometimes twice.
Mm-hmm.
And during that time, we also had trouble keeping drinking water, so we had to tow a so-called water barge over to this Cherry Point base and fill it up and bring it back to the Ocracoke base to sometimes once a month to keep water supply going.
Mm-hmm. Do you recall how the war affected everyday life here in the village?
Yes, things went on about as usual. Most of the submarine activity was 10 mile or farther offshore, and you would know there was activity going off there in the way of ships being sunk. You would see sometimes ships burning at night off the coast. You were always disturbed, but the submarines, I don't think ever picked on bigger city ports in the East Coast like Norfolk, Charleston, the seaport cities. They were mainly interested, I think, in destroying our shipping ships rather than destroying villages.
Did a lot of the men in town and any of the women that you can remember go to work for the naval base when the Navy?
Very few islanders were employed, other than the few that joined the Army, Coast Guard, Navy, the general service. all of that was taken care of by Navy personnel. That base was here from 1942 through closed in the end of the war, 1945.
Mm-hmm. Do you know what happened to that supply boat you were working on? Did it revert back to its
Yeah, that had a very sad interest and both interesting ending. The boat originally came down from Chesapeake Bay, and it was one of the bigger so-called bug-eye sailing schooners. It was turned into a motor vessel when it first came to Ocracoke to run the material from Cherry Point to Ocracoke. Well, then, at the conclusion of building the base, the Navy took this boat over to turn it into a supply boat, ice-refrigerated supply boat. After we used that during the entire war to run supplies into Ocracoke, the boat went back to Norfolk and was tied up, later sold back to the original owner that owned it at Ocracoke at the time. And I myself and Wahab Howard and Stanley Webb was the man that bought the boat, and we all three had shared in it. And after using it a year or two, we decided it wasn't going to be that profitable. So we advertised it and sold it back to a man on Chesapeake Bay. The boat went back up, was carried back up there, and the loader was cut down by a ferry running from Ocean View to Newport News.
It was cut down by a ferry?
By a ferry, one of the big ferries in the ferry train. So that was the end of that life of that boat, which was probably nearing 100 years old.
Can you tell me quickly about a bug-eye? How was it?
A bug-eye was a double-end, sharp both-end vessel, two-mast. Originally, all of them were sail. Later, they converted a lot of them with motors. This particular boat had an very old diesel motor in it, 3-cylinder motor that we nursed through the entire war. Kept patching it up. Normally, the Navy would have taken the stop and put a more powerful modern day diesel in it, but as I said, nursed it through the entire war, and that same engine was in the boat when it was sunk.
That's amazing. That's just amazing. Do you know how it got to be called Bug-Eye?
Bug-Eye. No, you're going to have to get that word from some interview up on Chesapeake Bay.
Okay.
You'll have to research that. Why? You're eventually going to be a reporter the rest of your life, or something, a writer, so you'll be gathering much material over the years and as you go back to
That's true. Well, thank you very much.